Okay, so tonight, many of you already know John Turner. We have the privilege of hosting John twice before for his first book on Brigham Young, and then again for the Mormon Jesus. And by the way, the Brigham Young book, I just want to quickly say, unfortunately, Yale is out of stock of all their copies. So we have one paperback available and one hardback that we actually saved, John, since 2012 when you were last here. Well, when you were here your very first time. So if you want a first edition in its original jacket, signed new from 2012, that's available, or a new paperback as well. But anyway, those are his previous books, and we're super excited to hear him discuss his book tonight. Joseph Smith.
Was that a Yale book or a Harvard book?
Harvard. It was Harvard.
Harvard from, Brigham Young was Harvard. So his current book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. With that, we turn the time over to John. Oh, really quick, if you wouldn't mind just turning off your phone so that we don't have any interruptions for the evening. And there will be refreshments outside afterwards. If you need to leave, if you can try and leave through the back door so we don't interrupt. Those are kind of our points of interest here. All right, sir. Clip this on. Wherever you feel comfortable with that. You can use this if you want. Whatever you want.
We'll see.
Okay.
So please let me know if I'm not loud enough in the back. I'll try to be louder. It's a total pleasure to be back at Benchmark Books. As Chris said, I was first here in 2012. And when I came in and I met Kurt for the first time, he said to me, "You don't look the way I expected you to." And I wasn't sure what he meant by that. I think he meant, I had in my mind that he thought I should look more like Brigham Young, like the later Brigham Young, with a really impressive beard. And I said, well, I'm about Brigham Young's height. And look more like the young, scrawny Brigham Young. So, I don't know, I'm no longer as young and scrawny. Benchmark, to me, is a really special place, community, and institution. There are so many, communities of book readers in the world today. There are, and I think especially in the Latter-day Saint context, there are a lot of study groups and book groups. There's a lot of virtual spaces online in which people connect over books. But this place is really something special because I don't think any other place could make an author feel so good because you come here and the nooks and the crannies are full, and it makes you feel, like famous and successful and welcomed all at once. And you all support so many authors, and also simply support the enterprise of scholarship and discussion about history, which I think is so important. And at this place, there's such a diversity of perspectives that are welcome. So I'm really grateful to be back. I've been looking. I think I may have decided. I decided after my Mormon Jesus book to, that maybe I'd written enough on Mormon history, so I wrote a book on something else. But then I decided I really want to get to come to Benchmark again. So, what the heck? I'll write a biography of Joseph Smith, and if I'm lucky, they'll have me back. And it'll only take me 5 years, so that's a good plan. So I thought. I'm just going to say a few things about the book and then welcome questions on all things Joseph Smith. No answers guaranteed, no answers you like guaranteed, but I'll do my best to engage with you on anything that you'd like. I thought I would just start with a few vignettes from a few different parts of Joseph's life that I think I could connect together. And I had them all dog-eared in my own copy, which I apparently have lost in the last half hour. So anyway, I think I can find them. So this is from when Joseph is 20 years old in 1826. One of those men, Jonathan Thompson, testified that he accompanied Joseph on one such nighttime errand. Joseph looked into his stone and discerned the location of a buried chest. The party started to dig, and then struck upon something sounding like a board or plank. Joseph explained that 2 Indians had quarreled while burying the trunk. One had killed the other, who had then been buried as the chest's guardian. You know, it occurred to me when thinking about that scene. Here's a young man, 20 years old, out in the woods with other young men, with torches, digging for things. That strikes me as fun. I think Joseph Smith, it's one of those subjects that people interested in Mormon history treat with a great amount of seriousness and debate and a touch of scandal. I think the 20-year-old Joseph Smith probably had a great deal of fun during those sorts of adventures and escapades.
Was it there?
What's that?
Was it there?
No, but it was still fun. Okay. Okay, this next one is from 1827. Joseph is 21 years old. Next came what Joseph's family and friends described as a harrowing errand. Joseph went to the hiding place on foot and wrapped the plates in a linen shirt. Fearing that his rivals were lying in wait to ambush him, Joseph decided it would be safer to return to the house through the woods rather than along the road. His enemies had spotted him, however. According to Lucy's account, his mother's account, 3 men attacked him on the way, each striking him with a gun. Joseph escaped by returning their blows with his fists. The 3rd attack left him with a dislocated thumb. Now, I'll grant you, it's probably not fun to get a dislocated thumb. However, again, here we are at night, in the woods, an adventure, an escapade. There are a lot of stories connected to the retrieval, the protection, the guarding of the plates in the fall of 1827. I think for Joseph, I think those were also thrilling and adventurous times. Okay, 1834. I have to apologize. I'd written in the ages because, I'm not a mathematician. I'm just a historian. But let's see, in 1834, Joseph is now 28 years old. Joseph's endurance of these hardships endeared him to his men. He's marching from Kirtland to Jackson County, Missouri. 2 weeks into the march, along a soggy portion of the National Road in eastern Indiana, Moses Martin saw the prophet wade in the mud over the tops of his bootlegs and helped draw the wagons out. On his prior trips to Missouri, Joseph had sometimes traveled by stage while other men had walked. During the march, however, the prophet walked nearly the whole way, just like everyone else. He slept in the same tents and ate the same scanty food. It wasn't easy. His feet were sore and blistered, and he was bothered by what he described as a little touch of my side complaint, probably lingering pain from the 1832 mob attack. Still, at age 28, Joseph was in his physical prime, and he held up well to the trip's rigors. Now again, this whole trip wasn't fun. It was difficult. There were some contentious moments with other people who were on, were part of this army of Zion. But I think for Joseph, these were good days. It was fun. It was an adventure. And I think he relished much of that time. He enjoyed clambering around mounds. He enjoyed the drills with the ragtag army that he was leading. Two other examples. This is from 1843, July of 1843. Joseph is 37 years old. He's just been tracked down by a couple of lawmen who are planning to try to expeditiously extradite him to Missouri. Joseph's captors brought him to a room at the Dixon Hotel. They intended to transport him to Missouri as soon as horses could be readied. An attorney came to the hotel, but Reynolds, one of the lawmen, shut the door in his face. "God damn you, I will shoot you," he yelled at Joseph. The prophet ripped open his shirt and repeatedly told him to shoot away. Reynolds and Wilson, the arresting officers, eventually backed down. Now again, I don't think it was particularly fun to be arrested, and I don't think it was especially fun to think about being extradited to Missouri and possibly killed. But again, here's Joseph Smith in the midst of danger. And I think there's a strong bluster and swagger, a comfort almost with these high stakes encounters. So I'm actually going to go back a couple of years to 1841. And that would make Joseph 35 years of age at this point. The next spring, on April 5th, 1841, Joseph Bates Noble took his sister-in-law across the river. In the creeping darkness of an early Nauvoo evening, the two Josephs and Louisa Beeman stood underneath an elm tree. Louisa disguised herself as a man with a coat and hat. Noble quietly repeated the words Joseph told him to use. It was done in a whisper, Noble recalled. For much of the next 2 years, there were clandestine meetings in which Joseph was sealed to plural wives, in which Joseph met his plural wives, in which Joseph sometimes met and dialogued with their families. Joseph would sometimes leave town and then separate from his companions and sneak back into town for some of those encounters. Again, if you think about that 20-year-old Joseph Smith in the woods, out at night, having adventures and escapades, Joseph still had that capacity to, I think, relish danger and excitement much later in his life. And Joseph himself said so. Caution was not his way. Deep water is what I am wont to swim in, Joseph explained. Joseph acknowledged that he often plunged right into dangerous currents. Excitement has almost become the essence of my life, he commented. When that dies away, I feel almost lost. And my comment, Joseph rarely let the excitement die. This was a man who was full of kinetic energy, who abounded with mirth, and who did not shrink from danger and controversy. I think perhaps toward the end of his life, Joseph should have let a little bit more of that die away. I think especially as external political opposition and internal dissent both sort of closed in on him during the last couple of years of his life. He didn't back away from that incautious part of his personality. And I think that tended to create additional hazards for him. So that's one element of Joseph's life that I've tried hard to preserve and lift up in this biography. Certainly there are parts of Joseph's life that I definitely think should be discussed seriously. And he had a very complex personality. I mean, alongside that thirst for excitement, he placed a strong order on decorum and order within the church. I mean, there are some counterpoints to what I'm talking about. But one of my goals was to write a relatively short, it's not that long, biography that would reflect some of that energy and mirth that Joseph brought to so many episodes of his life. And for me, those elements were among the many reasons why I really enjoyed researching and writing the book. And I hope that if you read it, that comes through to you, and that you also experience some excitement and mirth. Thought I would touch on one other question, and then open it up for questions and comments from you. One question I'm often asked, especially if I linger on some of perhaps the less complimentary parts of Joseph's life, I'm often asked, well, why did so many people follow Joseph Smith? What attracted individuals to him? And I think there are a number of reasons for that that I also try to touch on in this biography. One of them actually is the same thing that I just talked about. To follow Joseph Smith was incredibly exciting. He wasn't a fixed star. He was always in motion. There was always another, grander plan around the bend. There was always new teaching, new doctrine, new ideas that he might promulgate in his next discourse. I tend not to show up at my own church each week expecting to hear something really new and shocking. But I probably wouldn't have let my mind drift off too often during a Joseph Smith discourse. So I think that's one thing. A second thing is Joseph spoke to and provided solutions to genuine spiritual anxieties that many Americans shared during his lifetime. So, for instance, which of the churches is true? The Smith family, they were not the only Americans who wrestled with the chaos and confusion of religious freedom and pluralism in the early American Republic. And Joseph forthrightly engaged and answered that question. Only a small percentage of Americans agreed with his answer, but he certainly put his finger on something that troubled many people. Secondly, what about individuals who died without coming to faith or without being baptized or without joining a church? Here's one passage that I thought I'd share. Joseph knew that most Americans couldn't fathom his church's growth. Why is it this babbler gains so many followers and retains them? The prophet once asked. Joseph's answer was simple. People followed him because he possessed the principle of love. But it was also because Joseph offered them compelling solutions to their deepest needs. Most Americans did not accept those solutions. Surely the Gentiles will mock, Violet Kimball predicted when she wrote her husband about baptism for the dead. She was right. Newspaper editors and other critics loved the idea that the Mormons were frolicking in the Mississippi in order to save George Washington for eternity. It was easy to ridicule religious innovation, but many Americans agonized about loved ones who had died bereft of the faith that Protestant Christians insisted was necessary for their salvation. Joseph's doctrines and rituals went to the heart of these theological anxieties. It is no wonder that thousands of men and women were willing to move across the country and to sacrifice so much for the church and for its profit. And just quickly, I'd also say on the subject of marriage and sealing, that also addressed a genuine anxiety and grief experienced by many individuals. There are a number of instances in which Joseph is able to assure bereaved spouses that through a posthumous sealing, they can be assured of being with their departed loved ones forever. That was something that was a genuine balm to those individuals. Of course, that first element that I mentioned, always something new around the bend, always something grander, always new ideas. That also made it, for many individuals, incredibly stressful to follow Joseph Smith. Some people became fervent believers in the church and in Joseph's prophetic mantle, and then Joseph would unveil something new, want to lead somewhere else, and those individuals they wouldn't want to go any further with him. So his leadership also pushed people away as well. So that's a little bit of an introduction. I think there are plenty of things pertaining to Joseph Smith that we might want to chat about. So I would love any questions, objections, or also welcome anything. Yes?
I'm anxious to read your book on your emphasis on his mirth and buoyant spirit. I'd like to get your reaction to the historian B.H. Roberts and his monumental comprehensive history of the church. In volume 2, beginning at page 345, there's a chapter called The Character of Joseph Smith. And I wonder how many of the general authorities read that part of that book. He referred to Joseph being criticized for being light-minded often. And then he went into a list of other traits that could be considered, especially these days, negative. How did you respond to Roberts' rather candid observations in a church-sanctioned history of their founding prophet and church?
Well, I don't have a distinct memory of page 345 of volume 2 of History of the Church.
It starts there. But the whole chapter was on the character of Joseph Smith.
So, I think that's a great question. It makes me also think of a time in Joseph's life when he first visited Independence, and he's only there for a couple of weeks. And Ezra Booth, an early Methodist turned church member, is on the trip. Booth is disenchanted for a number of reasons, but among them, precisely that characteristic, that this man does not act the way a prophet should. There's too much levity. There's too much humor. He's not serious enough. And, you know, I comment in the biography that that is exactly what many other members of the church loved about Joseph, was that he didn't try to be an ultra serious, always sober, holy man. And he comments on that as well. So, you know, I'll have to refresh my memory on the passage that you mentioned. But you're right, and I think it's often difficult today, the juxtaposition between contemporary high-ranking church leaders. I'm not saying they don't have humor and mirth. They're not as rough around the edges as Joseph Smith. So sometimes when one brings up these, you know, rough edges of Joseph Smith, you know, the response might be, well, why would anybody have followed him? Well, his followers at the time didn't necessarily have the conception that Joseph should have acted the way that Latter-day Saint leaders would have acted in the early 21st century. Yes. Go ahead.
You briefly talk about Joseph Smith's polygamy and his marriage to Helen Mar Kimball. People today criticize that to the bitter end. Back then, John C. Bennett, Willie Wilson Law didn't say a word about the ages of his wives. What was the age of consent, and what was the thoughts around that? Because it strikes me as odd, no one seemed to have cared then.
Well, I think the question is Joseph's plural marriage to Helen Mar Kimball at the time that she was 14. The question is that her age at the time doesn't seem to have attracted a lot of attention, and so was that, you know, maybe not a significant issue at the time. So I think the age of consent in Illinois at the time was 12. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. I think 14 is young enough to have raised eyebrows, even if we don't have a record of those eyebrows being raised. You're right that relatively young marriage ages for women in particular were certainly not unheard of. People sometimes point to the fact that the governor of Illinois at the time, Thomas Ford, married a 15-year-old young lady when I think he might have been in his late 30s. It's not like wildly different. However, I do think in general that would have raised eyebrows. Todd Compton's essay on the subject I generally found persuasive in that Joseph's, you know, the marriage of someone, say, 37 to someone 14 would not have produced the reaction that it would produce today, but probably would have raised some eyebrows. Good question. Yes?
So in this, your wonderful thesis of this mirth, a two-part question. Do you see this lightness and this lifting up and the good old boys and follow, these boys playing? Does it peak and then it goes dark? Do you see it as going more dark than light? And coming back to the polygamy truly is, I see it as a good old boys club. I always call it celestial swinging. And at what point is this, we're doing polygamy, the men are, we've got to have 3 wives to get to heaven. It's all about the men. At what point is this club, is truly a club, this secret club, the Quorum of the Anointed, at what point did you ever see it at, it gets so dark and at the women's expense? Where does that play in? And I appreciate how you say this is super complex.
Sure.
And you obviously are great at understanding that.
So if you couldn't hear the question is, maybe for Joseph, polygamy was a fun adventure at times, but does it become something really dark, as far as the women are concerned? Or I would even add, as far as some of the men are concerned. So yeah, I find Joseph's practice of plural marriage troubling. I mean, first of all, it's an enormous subject, so there's a lot we could say about it. I don't think Joseph's primary motivation was sex. I don't think the marriages involved a large amount of sex. This is a bit speculative, but because the plural marriages don't produce children, I think there was, at best, infrequent sex. We know that some of the marriages were consummated. I speculate that, they might have been consummated and then there might not have been much ongoing sexual activity. That wasn't your question, I just thought I'd say that. But I would say, my own opinion is that this was extremely difficult for most of the women who were introduced to it. I think it's inherently troublesome by the standards of any day for a religious leader to persuade women to marry him the way that Joseph did, with an emphasis on, theological benefits, with the discussion of the spiritual threat he was under. I think he put a lot of pressure on women and their families, and I find that extremely troublesome. And I think Joseph certainly did not pay enough attention to the cost that this was exacting on the individuals who were involved. Sometimes that comes to the fore. For the Whitney family, he provides sort of a solution of sorts so that a plural wife will sort of have a sham husband. It's just all very, it's just all very disadvantageous, I think, for the women involved. And the toll on Emma is extreme in 1843. And that's a long story, so I won't rehearse it all. But I certainly find Joseph's treatment of Emma in this respect deeply troublesome. Great question. I know there's a question in the back, and I don't want to ignore people in the back. There was one on this side, I think, and then in the center as well.
Could you talk a little bit about Joseph's temper? In 1836, he had fracases with his brother William. Do you think that is a common thing about his temper?
So it's a great question. So I think it's actually mostly in late 1835. Joseph has sort of a months-long feud with his brother William, and he's really in a bad mood that fall with almost everybody. He's fighting with the apostles. He's doubting their loyalty. I think once he gets upset at Emma for leaving before the sacrament. So everybody's kind of taking it on the chin, and he has a physical fight with William. The question was, is that typical? I would say no. I mean, sure, Joseph could have a temper at times. I don't think that was a terribly consistent part of his personality. And, I explore some possible reasons for the sourness of his mood that fall, but it's actually not clear. But I would say no, that's not super typical. Couple of questions in the back, in the middle. You're just going to have to decide somebody to go first.
So there's 3 prior biographies on Joseph Smith: Fawn Brodie, Donna Hill, and Richard Bushman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what your book brings to the life of Joseph Smith that hasn't been touched.
Well, that is a great question. I thought you were going to ask me what. If you had just asked me what made it different from the others, I would have just said it's better. So you should read it. But that wasn't exactly what you asked. So no, I wouldn't say that. Anyway, I would say there's been a number of great biographies of Joseph Smith. So Fawn Brodie's is beautifully written. It's very out of date in terms of sources. It shouldn't be the the leading sort of critical, not faithful biography of Joseph Smith. And Donna Hill, Dan Vogel, Richard Bushman. A lot of people have dug around in this vineyard and planted their trees in it. So I guess one thing I would say is, and this is sort of what I touched on. I wouldn't say it's only this, but I have tried hard to capture Joseph's energy and dynamism. This is a bit of a shorter book than Rough Stone Rolling, and I hope that comes through. Also, Richard Bushman. I'm a fan, but we're writing from very different perspectives. He's writing from the perspective of a faithful Latter-day Saint who, as he says, privileges the testimony of those who were closest to Joseph. And I think that testimony should certainly be taken into account. But I certainly am, I am more skeptical. I'm more open, I think, to Joseph having, genuine flaws in his character and behavior. Not only flaws, but having them. And I think that's, that can be a bit muted in other portraits of him. So, I don't know. I have no idea where to turn. I'm just going to stay way in the back and then move forward.
Assuming I'm way back. How do you account for a fairly young adult, not well educated, being able to orate the complete Book of Mormon and then take on a scholarly retranslation of the Bible?
So how do I account for a young adult, not overly educated individual being able to dictate the Book of Mormon and undertake his own translation of the Bible? So that's a great question. So I do see the Book of Mormon as Joseph's literary effort. And so I do see him as the author of the text. So a couple of things I would say. Yeah, Joseph did not have much in the way of formal education. I would not regard him as a totally uneducated individual by the standards of the 1820s. I mean, his dad taught school on occasion. His parents taught him the Bible. He was super familiar with the Bible. When I read Joseph's handwritten letters, such as his June 1832 letter to Emma, it drips with the same sort of biblical allusion and style that one finds in the Book of Mormon and in some of his other textual efforts. So I have a fairly high regard for Joseph's intelligence, his creativity, his inspiration. So that certainly seems within the bounds of the possible to me. I know that's something that people debate and discuss, but I see that as a credit to Joseph Smith. Honestly, I think it is, to be fair, in response to your question, is a remarkable and audacious accomplishment, and I do see it that way. I feel like I got to go out in the hallway, and then I'm going to come to you next. Okay? Yeah.
So two follow-up questions. One on that.
Yeah.
You see yourself more, not being divinely inspired, more in a Dan Vogel approach, or like an Ann Tabbs approach to the where the morning comes from. And then the second one is, in your interview with Jana Reese, you used the word reckless to describe Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. If it wasn't for sex, why was he so reckless? What was the motivating factor that pushed him?
Okay, two great questions. So the first is, which I really like, it is my view of the Book of Mormon more of a Dan Vogel approach or of an Ann Taves approach. It's really a John Turner approach. So Ann Taves has I like her scholarship a great deal in terms of how something can become real and material to individuals. So for instance, whether or not Joseph possessed golden plates, right, they became real to other individuals, to the witnesses. And she makes an analogy to the way the wafer and the wine can really become the body and blood of Jesus Christ to, say, Catholic and Orthodox Christians. I think it's a smart analogy. I don't lean into that too much. I do reference it in relation to the witnesses, but to Joseph himself, I don't particularly understand the plates in that sense. In terms of Dan Vogel's approach to the plates themselves, one thing that I suggest is I grant the point that Richard Bushman and others have made that while there isn't evidence for any particular alternative explanation for the plates, whether that Joseph fashioned them out of tin, or whether he stumbled upon some printing plates and used them as the object. We don't know, right? There's no such evidence. But I don't think the absence of evidence for any particular or alternative explanation is itself evidence for the canonical explanation. So that's just the John Turner response. The second question I'm blanking on. I think it had to do with plural marriage and its recklessness, right? If there wasn't a lot of sex, what was Joseph's motivation? I think Joseph connected the extent of one's eternal heavenly glory to the size of one's family, and pursued an expansion of his family in a very rapid and sometimes reckless manner. And I would point out, in terms of the recklessness, once everything explodes into controversy in the summer of 1842 with John C. Bennett, Joseph is still at that very time pursuing additional plural wives. I think that's very reckless. I don't think that's, that's not I think that's just a descriptive, not a, particular judgment. Yes?
You've spoken about plural marriage. Were you not aware that there's cutting edge scholarship that teaches us that he was never a polygamist? I'm kidding. Okay, the second part is...
Actually, I wrote this biography of Brigham Young. everybody seemed to think that Joseph Smith had been a polygamist. And then I come back to this subject a decade later, and suddenly, all sorts of people think maybe he wasn't,
Right. The second question comes from the History of the Church, Volume 7, page 4. The second question is about Joseph Smith's return to Nauvoo and then on to Carthage. He's out near the Iowa side at a cabin. Emma sends some notes with him. Some old men go over and supposedly call him a traitor or whatever, and Porter Rockwell is standing there and does nothing. I don't understand that, first of all. And he says, if my life is of no value, my friends, what did you understand about that recrossing? You mentioned that everyone but Joseph kind of understood that he needed to come back because the city would be destroyed, but...
So it's a great question. So my own opinion is, there's some, I mean, it's sort of the answer would be complicated, so I have to, try to make it somewhat brief. Joseph has fled. Then there's some additional information that gives John Bernheisel, some additional confidence that Joseph would be protected. And I think at that point, almost everyone favors Joseph's return and surrender. And Heber Kimball's wife, specifically at the time, writes that Joseph stopped and composed his mind and got the will of the Lord concerning him, and that was that he should return and give himself up for trial. William Clayton, also contemporary, recorded that Joseph now saw no alternative. So there are these somewhat later sources that want to blame individuals, including Emma, for having pushed Joseph to return. The most contemporary source, and I think it's persuasive, is Joseph prays about it and concludes that God wants him to return and to protect the city. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, right, Joseph's murdered. And so in their ongoing grief and then also with some discord involved, people want to assign blame to different individuals for that. But I think the simpler approach is simply to look at the most contemporary sources in this case. So that was my approach. We better can't ignore the people in the front. So.
When you're talking about the plates, this is kind of a follow-up because you used the word audacious. You specifically use that in the book. You say, whether Joseph fashioned plates or put some other object in the box, the act was more audacious than mendacious. Well, we could say that about a lot of things about Joseph Smith, so where do you, in the balance of this book, decide that there's a line between the two, and how do you determine where that line is with regard to these kind of things?
That's a great question. So if you couldn't hear it in the back, I don't think that Joseph had golden plates. I think he put something in the box. There's some element of subterfuge here. And the passage that you were pointing to, I comment that I see this as more audacious than mendacious. And that's because, sometimes what people want is, okay, let's look at that. Does that make Joseph a fraud? Is that our summative conclusion about Joseph Smith? That's not my summative conclusion about Joseph Smith. I think, Joseph, he's 21 years old at this time. His family is completely down on its luck. He's completely impoverished. he doesn't want to repeat he doesn't want a banal life of farming. And Joseph comes up with what I think is just a remarkably audacious idea. And it combines an idea, it combines the possibility of making some money on this wild book project, but he also has a rich religious vision to articulate, doesn't have any other particular way of getting it into circulation. So I see this as an act of chutzpah and audacity. I don't see this as some huge moral failing that I need to condemn. So then you ask what's the line? There are some times in the biography in which I speak very critically of Joseph. For instance, after Orson Pratt contemplates killing himself over the issue of plural marriage, Joseph makes fun of him for it publicly about 6 weeks later, and sometimes puts, I think, vile rumors about Nancy Rigdon and Sarah Pratt into circulation. Yeah, I think that's that for me that's an occasion for me to express some moral judgment. And I think it's a good question. I mean, I don't think the main task of a historian is to be on one's moral high horse and pass judgment on people. It's to try to explain, to document what somebody did and why they did it. But I also decided in writing this book, I didn't want to pull any punches, and when I encountered things that I thought were important, I wanted to give my best judgment. So, yes, Joe.
Hi. Since you've researched these two very strong personality people, any ideas, any thoughts on why one followed the other, why one succeeded the other for the most part?
Well, the main reason that Brigham Young succeeded Joseph Smith is because he was 2 weeks older than Heber Kimball. So that's the simple answer to your question. This will be slightly off topic, but one thing that's always struck me about Brigham Young that was incredibly wise is that he didn't decide to try to imitate Joseph Smith. He didn't try to be Joseph Smith. So he sort of tried his hand at dictating the word and will of the Lord. He didn't want to lead that way. So he decided simply to lead through his words and his sermons rather than dictating revelations like Joseph. I think that was an incredibly wise decision. I think they both had a lot of spiritual fire. They both had a lot of capacity for organization. I don't think there's not a huge dichotomy between a revelator and an organizer. They both had elements of that. I think Brigham was, he was less kinetic. Every year there wasn't a new huge grand plan. So I think in a way his leadership was a bit steadier a lot of the time. Richard.
I was just wondering, it doesn't look like he used the Joseph Smith papers as a source. I was just curious as to why.
I extensively use the Joseph Smith papers as a source. And the way I cited them may have been confusing, I don't know. But I relied heavily on them. And, I almost feel like a really lazy historian writing this biography, getting toward the end of the Joseph Smith papers. Their spade work was absolutely essential. So I think we have time for one more question or so. So I'm not sure. We'll do two more from people who haven't asked yet. Maybe first on my left and then one more down the center.
Oh, sure. Kind of like Joe's question. It read very differently than the Brigham Young biography, and I'm wondering if your writing process was different, or like how you research on a writing process for the biographies different if they did. Yeah,
for this one, I relied on Anthropic's Claude AI program. I don't know. I mean, I think honestly, I don't think my process hasn't changed that much. I don't know what you thought was different, but I tried harder to make it move. I tried really hard not to. I love theology and minutia. So I think when I wrote Brigham Young, I tended to do a little bit more of that, and then sometimes lose sight of Brigham for multiple pages. And I tried not to go more than a page without, Joseph being. So I tried to do that. Usually what happens is I try really hard to write, popularly accessible history, and I give it my best effort, and then, other people read it and say, man, that's really academic and dry. And then that breaks my heart, and I try to do better next time. So, yes.
This is kind of a personal question, I guess, but of your three, Mormon studies books that you've written, I'm interested if you have a sense of which one of them maybe felt the riskiest to write. And maybe none of them were risky. I don't know, but
I mean, is the ghost of Porter Rockwell around the corner or something? Am I in danger?
in terms of to take on people of this stature within a religious tradition from a religious studies perspective, but not being LDS. I mean, there have to be some, uncertainties lingering in your own mind, right, about how is this going to be received. Of the three, I mean, which of these did you find yourself kind of, I don't know, risk is just a word I think of.
Yeah.
Maybe an even better question though is, of these three, which do you think is the most important contribution to a Mormon studies conversation?
I mean, I should say this one because I want everybody to buy it and read it. So I will say that, I'm more risk averse than Joseph Smith, for sure. I think, when writing this book, let me back up and say, with Brigham Young, I felt as if I didn't have to write about some foundational questions in terms of the origins of Mormonism. So for Brigham Young, he accepted the Book of Mormon as an ancient record. He accepted Joseph Smith as God's prophet. He accepted the Church of Christ as Christ's true church. He accepted plural marriage as a divine commandment. So, you could sort of just take those and go on with the story. For Joseph Smith, I did feel like I had to engage